that Larry Kudlow, who's White House chief economic advisor, has suffered a heart attack and is now at Walter Reed Medical Center. We don't have any additional information at this point about the seriousness of this incident or Mr. Kudlow's condition, but obviously a lot of concern, both for those of us in the news biz who know him from this world, but also for everybody receiving this news tonight.
This also means, not to put too fine a point on it, that in the moments prior to shaking the hand of Kim Jong-un, the president tweeted out this news about his longtime friend and now aide, Larry Kudlow. This also means that there are perhaps, God forbid, Kudlow family members who did not know this news until it showed up on the Twitter feed of Donald Trump. Peter's right. Larry Kudlow has been known to a lot of us for a lot of years. He's a man who dealt with addiction very publicly, very forthrightly, rebuilt his life. He was an economic official going back to the Reagan years. So obviously thoughts are with Larry Kudlow tonight. We've been joined by two gentlemen here in New York. Chris Matthews is with us, having just gotten off the air with tonight's edition of Hardball. And Ben Rhodes is with us. Ben joins us, as they say, from the Obama administration, former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Barack Obama. If you've been on Amazon or a bricks and mortar bookstore in the last couple of days, then you have seen his new book, which just came on to the market. Both of them always have books. You always have books.
We have a lot of administrations represented here. Have you noticed?
Yeah, that's true.
Ben, let me ask you, we've been talking a lot thus far this hour about the decision to hold this summit. Not necessarily what we're going to learn as the outcome of this summit. We'll find out over the course of the evening. What was the process around deciding things like this in the Obama administration? Who do you decide to say yes to when they ask for a meeting with the President of the United States? And how do you decide?
Well, you look for an opening, Rachel. With Cuba, for instance, we saw an opening. We reached out to the Cubans to see if they wanted to establish a secret channel. But I met with Alejandro Castro, Raul Castro's son, 20 times before we put Barack Obama in the room with Raul Castro. It took a lot of prep work, well over a year or two. So what is strange about this is what I feel happened here is that they were on a road to conflict. President Moon in South Korea was very uneasy with that. He took the initiative. He brought that back to the White House, but then Trump kind of took this out of the hands of the South Koreans and accelerated this process to get to this summit. Normally, you'd have much longer lead time to develop the agenda, to figure out, as Nicole was saying, what are we trying to achieve in this meeting before we put the head of state in the room? How are we going to be positioned coming out of this? So what I feel like here is the South Koreans took the initiative, Trump wanted the show, and here we all are.
And it wasn't just the South Koreans, though. He literally took the South Koreans out of H.R. McMaster's office.
Yeah.
If you go back to the way it actually happened and TikTok through how we got here, it was a meeting that Trump wasn't even supposed to participate in. It would have been someone with your job doing the groundwork.
And it's still not clear to me, by the way, that what the South Koreans were coming to propose was a head of state summit.
Correct.
They were probably coming to say, Kim says he's open to talking, which the North Koreans have always been open to doing. Trump kind of short circuits the whole thing, goes out, has it announced that night.
Opens the door to the lower press office, to the briefing room.
I believe there was a Mueller story in the news that day.
You think? It didn't feel like
making it so unlike the other day.
Put it this way, that is not how I think you or we would have done this, right? You would have taken a lot of time just to announce this summit. I mean, we cannot, I mean, I just want to step back here for a second, you know, because everybody's going to be focused on the show tonight. The rest of the world is going to be rearranging itself to this event. And when they're looking at a couple things, they're looking at the fact that we're coming into this event having just had a fight with all of our closest allies in the world. Unprecedented rupture in the Atlantic Alliance.
A big performative fight that was done in public and shown to everybody with exclamation points.
Substantive and performative, right? There's substantive issues and there's this personal vitriol from Trump, right? If I'm sitting there in Japan and South Korea, as you guys are saying, and I'm thinking, well, this is the ally, the United States, that I rely on for my survival. Are you really going to trust that Donald Trump is a reliable partner, that he's going to follow through not just on whatever he says to Kim Jong-un, but on the security guarantees that we give to them? And frankly, I think we're going to see a kind of reordering in the world here over the next couple of years rooted in some of the events that we saw this week, not just this summit, but what we just saw at the G7.
We've been talking a lot about how this is different than a normal process. What's the risk of not having a note taker in the room? What's the risk of the president bragging that he hasn't prepared, and we have no reason to disbelieve him on that? It seems like he hasn't prepared. I mean, obviously it's strange, it's a departure, but is it dangerous or is it just odd?
Well, there are a few places I could go here. One, you always have a note taker for a simple reason. I mean, even when Obama was alone in the room with whoever it might have been, Putin, anybody else, the reason you have a note taker is that there's clarity on what was agreed to and what wasn't. Because there's a huge risk that Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un could walk out of that one-on-one discussion with very different ideas of what they had just talked about or what they had just agreed to. And the note taker is the one who can read out the rest of the U.S. government, by the way, on what happened. So right now, the only person who will know what was discussed in that room is Donald Trump. Will he tell his own government about what was discussed? Will his representation of what was discussed be accurate? Or will he try to make himself look better in his readout to his own team?
Ben, do interpreters ever play a dual role?
Good question.
In terms of doing for both
Direct
countries?
recall of the subject matter when they get out of the room?
No. I mean, you would not want to put an interpreter in that position. Their position is to be thinking only about one thing. How am I, translating these words that are being spoken? They're not trained. It's not their position, their job, to be thinking about how am I going to read out the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State over what was discussed,
Wow.
And so the concern here is that, Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, probably not the two most trustworthy people in the world, are the only people who are going to know what is discussed in this besides those interpreters. And that's the whole reason why you always have somebody.
I have been assuming that the interpreters had a dual role. I've been assuming that the interpreter is some master spy. No.
Let's talk about definitions. What I'm worrying about, and I've been studying on this, that there's a problem of specificity here, which is we say denuclearization of the peninsula, and what Kim means by that is we get rid of our troops. We've got to get rid of the nuclear umbrella, the tripwire at the 38th parallel. We take out the works, leaving South Korea exposed to their artillery, to their firepower. And who won that one? We just lost. Now, does Trump know, do you think, Ben, that when they say denuclearize, they mean we get out, we remove the umbrella from Japan, we remove the umbrella from South Korea, we get our troops out? That's what I'm worried about. I'm talking about ending the state of war between the two countries. Because the minute you start talking like that tonight, in that first magic minute, I'm thinking, wait a minute, they're talking about us leaving. No matter what else they're talking about, they're not talking about nuclear. They're saying we're going to have a peace treaty between North and South, and then you're going to leave, and we're going to denuclearize the peninsula. In other words, you're taking everything you've got out, and at some point down the road, we may stop developing our nuclear program, which we're going to keep ready to do. And they're going to win.
I mean, the two things that worry me, as has been said, they've committed to denuclearize time and again in the past. So if they have in that joint statement a big commitment to denuclearize, which Trump will lift up, it doesn't really mean anything until we can get on the ground and see that they're following a roadmap to denuclearize.
Will they give us a list of their weapons tonight?
Well, not just a list, though. We need a list, and we need international inspections. We need to have people to verify this. But the other thing, Chris, is Trump has been saying for years that why do we have troops in South Korea? Why do we have troops in Japan?
He's walking into this.
So there's actually a track record of him saying, well, we shouldn't provide the security guarantee here. And that's why one of the winners out of this could be China, because they're sitting there thinking, I would like nothing more than have the United States pull back from Northeast Asia. We want to fill that void. They're already filling it. If you travel across Asia...
They're making their own islands.
Yeah, you travel across Asia, people feel like we are backing out now, and the Chinese are moving in. The one exception to that has generally been our treaty allies in South Korea and Japan. If there's any kind of inkling that we're putting on the table troops in that region, that's going to be a game changer in terms of how people look at geopolitics in Asia.
But President Trump might not even see it as a concession. He's too willing to give away the troop card. So in this one-on-one 45 meeting, this is what I'm definitely afraid of, is that he's going to put that on the table, not even as a concession, but because he actually doesn't think we even need troops.
Well, and he's done it before. He had a one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin and relied on the Russian translator, and we were left with the he said in terms of understanding what happened. And you're right. No one put the Russian translator in the position of going out and telling the press. I mean, Trump has done this before.
In terms of what else the president might see as and a not too valuable thing that would be okay to give away. What about this issue of a peace treaty? North Korea and South Korea split in 1948. There's cessation of hostilities in 1953, but we don't have a peace treaty. Technically, hostilities are still ongoing, which seems insane and seems like a weird way to think about it. So what would it be substantively to move toward a peace treaty, to move toward that sort of an agreement?
Well, for North Korea, what it would mean is a diminution of our presence in the Korean Peninsula. That would start with us ceasing certain military exercises in the region. It would then lead to us moving certain military hardware out of the region. And ultimately, it would get at this question of whether there should be U.S. troops in South Korea. Because technically, they're there, as part of the arrangement where we're providing for their security, given that there is no peace agreement. So for the North Koreans, look, be very clear as you're talking about. I'm a progressive. I like talking better than fighting. Yeah. But my worry here is that he's going to put stuff on the table that you shouldn't put at the beginning of the process. The North Koreans want a nuclear deterrent. They want international legitimacy. They want sanctions relief. And they want less U.S. military presence in Northeast Asia.
And Donald Trump already talked about wanting to give all four of those things.
North Koreans don't need to ask for reduction of troops. All they have to ask for is a peace treaty because it sounds good. It sounds historic. Who would argue against ending the war? Except the problem is it removes the legal justification and undercuts the political rationale for us having our troops in South Korea. So it will come up. South Koreans will later ask, we don't have war anymore. Even Americans might say, why do we have our troops in South Korea? Didn't we end the war? Let's bring the boys home. So that really just undercuts the rationale for our troop presence.
That's the giveaway, isn't it?
Yes.
If they push in that direction in the first couple hours, that's what he's pushing for.
Yes, that's what he wants by saying regime security, we need regime security. We need peace.
And the Japanese are very scared of that.
Another one of our veteran analysts has just joined us, and that's Jeremy Bash, former chief of staff at CIA, former chief of staff at Pentagon. So his bona fides are clear and on point for this conversation. Jeremy, if you've been listening to the conversation, then you know several people have made the point that this is before the first handshake, before the first photograph of the two together, victory North Korea.
A summit is not an accomplishment for the American president, Brian. It is a major accomplishment for Kim Jong-un. And in fact, the spectacle of seeing the American flags along with the DPRK flags as the backdrop for that handshake is really jarring, actually, to see, to witness. In fact, I would say it's somewhat disgusting. It is actually a debasement of the American flag. This is a despotic regime that murders its own citizens. And so we're putting him on the same stage as the American president. Now, hopefully, it will serve a larger purpose, which is to ensure security for American interests and our allies in the peninsula. And obviously, Brian, you see there the arrival.
Carrying his briefing book, Kim Jong-un getting out of his armored Mercedes and going into the older portion of this building. And we'll see if we have other cameras to switch to after his vehicle clears. Jeremy, go ahead.
So he has arrived on Sentosa Island at the hotel resort where the meeting will take place. And as I was saying, the mere fact that he'll be standing at that shot that you see in your screen there alongside the American president is a major accomplishment for the North Korean dictator. We should not lose sight of the fact. The second thing is, this has been alluded to on the panel before, is North Korea has, according to published reports, 60 nuclear weapons. They have a plutonium processing facility at Yongbyon. They have probably a very sophisticated uranium enrichment program in which they are spinning cascades, centrifuges in which they are building an additional capability to develop nuclear weapons through that path. They have long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, which can hit Chicago and Denver. The only yardstick, Brian, by which we can measure success of this entire process is not whatever statement comes out tonight. It's whether those missiles, those weapons, those nuclear facilities are removed and the danger is removed to the threat to the United States and our allies. That's the only metric upon which we can measure whether this is at all successful.
Well, Jeremy, let me ask you another math question, and that is this. Take nukes out of the conversation. Seoul is a metropolitan area, give or take 25 million people, give or take 35 miles from the border. How many artillery tubes are embedded in those mountains aimed at Seoul and its surrounding suburban area?
Probably 50 to 100,000. There's no anti-rocket artillery mortar system in the world that could defend the population of Seoul from an onslaught from North Korea. In fact, one of the concerns we've had is that when the Trump administration was talking publicly about a potential first strike against North Korea, The concern, of course, was that North Korea would retaliate, not necessarily against the United States, but against Seoul. And now you see the additional tape here of the arrival.
Yeah.
The playback of the arrival of Kim Jong-un at the hotel there as he enters the building and gets ready for his historic meeting with President Trump.
As someone recently said that the Mercedes limousine has been the favorite of dictators and despots going back decades around the world.
Yeah, you just see the no license plate thing, and it just puts a little shiver down your spine. You know what I'm saying?
That'd get you pulled over in New York.
Jeremy, I had one question for you about previous experience with the North Koreans and talks. Obviously, no U.S. president has ever talked to a North Korean dictator before, but Madeleine Albright was there in 2000, and we've had former President Jimmy Carter there. We've had former President Bill Clinton there for different reasons. There's been different talks around hostage releases and other sorts of things. When the North Koreans in the past have cheated on disarmament deals, when they cheated in 1994, when they cheated in 2002, when they reneged on deals, did we learn anything from that? Is there anything that's more sophisticated about our interactions and negotiations with them now because of that previous experience of them playing previous U.S. administrations?
Yes, we've learned many things, Rachel. There was a very significant incident in the early 2000s in which, during one of the engagements with the North Koreans, they acknowledged the fact that they had a uranium enrichment path to a bomb in addition to the plutonium path. And then, of course, once the six-party talks broke down, of course, in 2006, North Korea detonated its first nuclear test. And since then, we've seen 6 nuclear tests. Last summer, we were probably at the height of provocation with those 2 overflights of Japan, the 2 ICBM tests, and another nuclear test. So they have made great progress. And in fact, I think it's fair to say that one of the reasons why Kim Jong-un believes he has the standing, the ability to stand next to the American president at this hour is because he has achieved a level of nuclear deterrent that has effectively achieved his aims in the region. And now he's ready to trade away a little bit of that deterrent for a security guarantee. And I agree with the earlier panelist who noted that if we come out tonight with a statement about a peace treaty, that is precisely what Kim Jong-un wants. Right. And President Trump wants it because there's no such thing as a Nobel Denuclearization Prize. There's only a Nobel Peace Prize.
I think I just spotted the still photographer Will McNamee, so that would indicate that the White House still press pool is there. And so we have journalists from the United States and state-run media from North Korea.
And we are expecting, it's interesting, politics editor here at NBC News was noting earlier this hour that at the G7, which President Trump has just come from in Canada, he was late to everything at the G7, all the different meetings. This seems to be rolling out quite punctually this evening, which is why we're watching the clock while we're also watching these live feeds. We've seen Kim Jong-un arrive to emerge unsmiling from that big black Mercedes limousine, holding a briefing book and walking straight into the venue. We are expecting President Trump momentarily, and then we are expecting a handshake. And that moment will be the culmination of decades of effort by the North Korean regime, by Kim Jong-un, by his father, and by his father before him, in terms of trying to achieve this as the ultimate imprimatur of international legitimacy. President Trump has bestowed that already, and now we're about to see it made manifest as the president arrives.
Here is the president's limousine now coming up to that same entrance where we saw Kim Jong-un dropped off. By comparison, this is the brand new Cadillac limousine that has been airlifted halfway around the world for the purpose. So let's see if we have any audio from this, and otherwise we'll just take in the pictures of the president's arrival.
You bet.
So Ben Rhodes, President goes in there. We will see, presumably, when they first come together, though they may meet and then only emerge for the photo after knowing each other a short time. The president rather famously already said this weekend he needed just about a minute to size up his equivalent. Ben, how much of the infrastructure of diplomacy and foreign affairs that would have traveled on a trip like this during your years is missing? Are vacant positions, is not perhaps venerated enough to be on a trip like this?
Well, basically, the infrastructure that you would use to prepare for a successful summit has not been in place. I mean, Victor Cha was here. He'd be a very good ambassador in Seoul. You know, we've had many State Department roles vacated. We had in the Iran deal.
Wait, can you just say what you mean there? Victor Cha was
going to be the nominee for our ambassador to Seoul, and you know, he said something along the way that upset somebody in the White House and got his appointment yanked back. Just like we've had lots of unfilled slots at the State Department, including many of the people who would have been doing the prep work for this summit. Secondly, we had in the Iran nuclear negotiations Ernie Moniz, you know, a world-renowned nuclear physicist who literally could sit there and tell you, what we needed to get on centrifuge reductions, what we needed to get in terms of converting a plutonium reactor.
Nobel Prize winner.
Yes, a Nobel Prize winner. You know, they didn't have to chant the Nobel, after the Iran deal. He had it already. And, they're not even bringing people with scientific expertise to the table to try to think through what is the scope of the North Korean program, how do we get assured that they're going to put constraints on it, and not just have a bunch of international journalists in, blow up a building and say, we've kept our commitments. So what I have not seen is, the scientific experts, the sanctions experts, the diplomatic experts, the types of people who would have spent months plowing the ground to make this a successful summit. They have not been present for this. Instead, we get the pageantry. We did have Mike Pompeo do some pre-meetings, but not clear what has been going on at a lower level. And now you have President Trump showing up for really what is a spectacle.
Sloppy wording by me a moment ago. I didn't mean to say these gentlemen were equivalent. That was not a chosen word. Just came
counterpart.
Flying, I guess. Sure, came
well,
flying.
They are now, though. That's the key thing.
It does strike me we're at 9:02 Eastern Time. Normally, we would be watching one Rachel Maddow.
I'd be hemming and hawing my way through something now. As we await this handshake, Sumi Terry, I wanted to ask you to just kind of put us in the mind frame here of North Korean defectors, North Korean dissidents, people who have survived this regime, the most repressive totalitarian dictatorship on the face of the earth. When they see this handshake that's about to happen, what is that going to mean to people?
I think they feel betrayed, particularly because we're not putting human rights on the table. Because as you said, this is a man that's accused of crime against humanity. United Nations came up with a 400-page report talking about North Korea. There's no parallel in contemporary history to what's going on in North Korea in terms of human rights violations. The only parallel they're talking about is Nazi Germany. So I think when the defectors are looking at this, they don't know what to make of it. I know there are many defectors in South Korea and some here who are very unhappy with it. But what they want, at least fervently hope, is that at least President Trump raise the issue and make it a part of, if there's going to be some sort of normalization process, we have to make human rights issue a part of that.
We've just been told by the, sorry, Nicole, the pool producers who manage the cameras and wrangle the reporters who are there on scene tell us we're within the 2-minute window where we will see the leaders come out. Nicole, I was fascinated to hear Jeremy Bash say that even the iconography, which we, to be honest, have duplicated here in this studio, of the two flags together is diminishing to the U.S. side. Let's take in this moment.
Nice to meet you, Mr. President. I'm very happy to meet you here in Singapore. Many people in the world will think of this as a city from the fact of scientific fiction. Well, of course, this is just a
Wow.
See the photographers there scrambling to try to catch whatever else they can. We could hear that they were talking, at least to me. I couldn't necessarily make out what they were saying.
Very difficult.
There were some direct words, and then there were some translators.
Did you like the competition with the arms and the body movements where the president would grab him and sort of lead him like he was escorting him, and then he went back and grabbed his arm. Kim grabbed his arm.
It was very tactile.
They were competing there, man to man.
Well, it's at least a lot of touching. I'm not sure.
Yes, a lot of touching,
Yeah.
competitive touching.
But it's Trump. I mean, not to get too weird about this, but it's the president touching Kim Jong-un a lot.
Wow.
It's not mutual.
There's a Neil Diamond song about that.
See what I'm saying? It's him. There's a lot of gesturing and touching, and a hand on the back, hand on the arm. There's a lot of smiling by the president, too.
Can I say, I've heard from 3 national security officials since we've been on the air who have really grave concerns about what Ben described. The idea that all the substance of this meeting will take place in this one-on-one meeting without any foreign policy advisors. And I think as that has seeped in, as it has sunk in, that that's sort of it. They don't leave that meeting and have a 3 days that follow to drill down on the different areas. But a lot of alarm this hour. Also on Larry Kudlow, a lot of concern I'm picking up from folks in and around the White House about him. He's beloved. He's not been there long, but he's beloved. He's beloved by the president. He's beloved by the staff. Obviously, he's one of our colleagues, beloved here. But
we should just mention what that's about in case you are just joining us. As the president was heading in his motorcade toward this event, the president, somebody operating the president's Twitter account, possibly the president himself, tweeted that the White House Chief Economic Advisor Larry Kudlow has suffered a heart attack and is being treated at Walter Reed. We do not have additional information about Mr. Kudlow's condition, but as Nicole noted, a lot of concern among people who know him and who work with him.
And the person that folks feel most concerned about not being in that meeting are obviously a national security advisor and an intelligence official because of how little we know about the program and because it's possible that Donald Trump will leave and we still won't know.
So appears to be alive.
They never stop. I feel really great. We're going to have a great discussion, and I think tremendous success. We'll be tremendously successful. And it's my honor, and we will have a terrific relationship, I have no doubt.
우리는 아주 굉장히 성공할 걸로 믿습니다. 그리고 아주 만나게 돼서 굉장히 영광스럽게 생각합니다. 아주 훌륭한 관계를 가지고 있고 아주 전혀 의심 없이 좋은 관계를 우리가 맺을 거라고 생각합니다.
여기까지 오는 길이 쉬운 길은 아니었어요.
Well, it was not easy to get here.
우리한테는 우리 발목을 잡는 그 과거가 있고 또 그럴 땐 분변과 관행들이 우리 때로는 우리 눈과 귀를 가리우기도 했는데 우리 모든 것을 이겨내고 이 자리까지 왔습니다.
The past worked as fetters on our limbs, and the old prejudices and practices worked as obstacles on our way forward, but we overcame all of them, and we are here today. That's true. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
This way. Thank you.
All right, guys, let's go.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
What you just saw there, when you are pool cameraman or woman, your job is to stay open and stay shooting as long as you can.
Yeah, I hope they keep the shot, actually. It gives us a sense of what kind of location they're in their isolation.
Get you out. So they're being led down a hallway. Sumi Terry is here. It strikes me with your language skills, perhaps you picked up more of that than we did.
Well, first of all, I have to tell you, it just still floors me every time I hear Kim Jong-un speak. This is the second time I heard him
We don't
speak.
hear his voice. Yep.
Yeah, but Kim Jong-un, when he spoke with Moon Jae-in, it's just so surprising to me still. I'm like, wow, I'm actually hearing North Korean leaders talk, because Kim Jong-il, of course, never spoke. Kim Jong-un, we don't have even one recording of Kim Jong-il speaking with his father. He was a total recluse. Very interesting. Kim Jong-un said in Korean, obviously, that it was a very hard road for us to get to here. It was not an easy road. It was a very difficult road, but here we are.
That's in contrast to what the president said. The president said, it's my honor. We will have a terrific relationship. I am sure it is going to be a success. The president giving him a thumbs up.
Yeah.
So you're saying there was a contrast in tone.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not that he was being negative. He was acknowledging the difficult road that they had to walk before they could get here. Okay. Right? So, but it's interesting because just when you look at the body language, I guess they tried not to overly be smiley, because Kim Jong-un, when he met with Xi Jinping or Moon Jae-in, was much more jovial, lighthearted. So I just have to tell you, next 45 minutes is going to be very, very nerve-wracking moments for me. I hope President Trump doesn't.
What are you the most worried about?
What we were discussing earlier, that President Trump, without there's no record of it, what he would offer Kim Jong-un, what he would offer on the table before we're going to see any kind of real, complete, verifiable denuclearization of North Korea. So I don't want him to offer a peace treaty. That would be my nightmare scenario. And I don't want him to offer what Japan is worried about, some sort of a half-measure deal, a deal on intercontinental ballistic missile that does maybe protect our homeland, but that doesn't take care of Japan and South Korea's interests.
And this is what the former intelligence officials are worried about, that because Trump doesn't read his PDB, he is not in the room with the intel on these matters that you raise. And because there is not a national security advisor in the room, and because he doesn't consume a PDB, and because there's no intelligence official in the room, what is agreed to, and the bare minimum that I'm hearing that can come out of here is a set of principles. But that he's not even armed with the kind of experts that can get him to agree to a set of principles, because he doesn't know the intel, he doesn't know the weapons, and he may very well do what you fear.
And, one of the things I couldn't help but think about watching that is, I remember the first meeting that President Obama had with Raul Castro, for instance. And we made very certain that in that press availability that they just had, that President Obama would say, we're going to continue to have differences. That, we had to say something that got at the fact that just because we're having a meeting doesn't mean that we agree about everything. We obviously had differences with Cuba on human rights. I didn't hear anything about that from Donald Trump. I just heard how great it is to be there as an honor. Second thing is, you also know that the North Koreans have a state-run media. They can splice that footage any way they want. So they just got the President of the United States of America saying it was an honor to sit down with Kim Jong-un. His grandfather, his father, never achieved that. He just accomplished something that neither his grandfather or father achieved, and he didn't have to give anything away to do it.
And clapping him on the back and holding him by the arm and smiling and giving the thumbs up.
And that will run in a loop on North Korean television.
That is so historically significant. At the end of the Cold War, we found out that Erich Honecker, the last dictator of East Germany, his greatest dream, even though he probably didn't like the United States, was to be received at the White House. And it was, see, countries that don't like us still respect us. They still know we're the greatest country in the world. And to be received by the president, be treated as an equal, gives them something forever. And I think the thing about Trump, I keep thinking, everybody tends to take the job they're given and turn it into who they are, and to try to find a way to fix their personality to the job. Trump has turned the presidency into a television show. And this is his show. You used the term earlier. You said, this is a show. The meeting to the other is, for him it was, I get to be sitting next to the president. That's my photo op for history. For Trump, it's somehow this meeting itself, and they get along, and they'll come out with an hour or two later where they communicate how much we like each other, and he likes basketball and I like basketball, or some nonsense. The show itself seems to be what the ultimate goal for Trump is. And the other guy, it's the photo op.
As a matter of the visual here, I also have to say it is a little bit weird that they appear to be sitting on a Persian carpet.
What does that say? They're
just
flying?
In terms of the Iran,
they're flying?
No, in terms of the Iran deal. I mean, they're sitting literally on a. I mean, I'm no expert, but
Sue, I'm worried that we have viewers tuning in who may have just heard you say that you hope they don't agree to a peace treaty. Explain what that means for people who may not get the true meaning.
Well, the Korean War began in 1950. When it ended in 1953, we didn't formally end the war. So Koreans are still technically at war. When you conclude a peace treaty, that formally ends the war. But what we are talking about is that, what is that meaning? Or what is the meaning of that, right? What is the consequence of that? What is the implication of that? When you end the war formally, they will undercut the rationale of our commitment, our alliance commitment with South Korea. They will undercut the rationale for our troop presence in South Korea. Because there's no war, why do we need our troops in South Korea? So what I'm afraid of is not that peace treaty is bad. Of course, formally ending the war is fine and it's good, it's historic. But what if we end the war and North Korea does not give up nuclear weapons program? Because that's probably what's going to happen. So we've just ended the war, leave South Korea still under threat, under their nuclear weapons and North Korea's nuclear weapons, and we just gave away the major card.
Do you think Trump is that unaware of what you just said to blow
yes.
it?
This is about, I talked to two of his friends as I was here. This is about looking like a strong leader. This is about projecting strength to a domestic audience. This is not about what keeps you awake at night. This is not about the job you had. We're projecting onto him normal things. There's nothing normal about what we're watching. We are not watching an American president conduct the most grave and serious.
But what he does is binding. It's what he does.
Of course it is, but he was excited to go for that reason. That picture right there, for this, that we're all sitting here. I heard from two people. He's excited because he thinks that makes him look like a strong leader, and that's the image he wants to project for his own re-election campaign and in the midterm.
In the 2008 election, Barack Obama was criticized for saying that if he were president, he would absolutely consider meeting and talking with the North Koreans. He said he would talk with Cuba. He said he would talk with North Korea. He said he would talk with Iran. He said he would talk with our enemies. And that was cause for the American right to decide that Barack Obama was not just a Democrat. He was a foreigner who was sent on some nefarious mission to destroy the United States from within.
He was weak. I mean, that
was seen as weak, and it was seen as being naive, and it was seen as dangerous. The relationship between American politics in this moment is almost as hard to get your head around as these pictures are.
You know, Rachel, that's almost like retrieval from college ball days, because today everything is hour by hour, and people, the lack of memory to retrieve that information is so normal now. People, is that right? Was that the campaign?
And when was Barack Obama president?
It's astounding, but it's so pertinent to what we're talking about. Is to take a chance on a meeting like this.
Yeah.
And Obama says, well, occasionally we have to make these reaches for opportunity. But we'll see.
I saw the scars, Rachel, from the. I mean, I went to work for Barack Obama the week that he had the debate where he said he would be with the leaders of Iran, North Korea, and Cuba if he, thought it could advance our interests. And the fact of the matter is, we met with Iran and Cuba. There's a reason actually we didn't meet with North Korea,
which was.
Well, the reason was that what you just saw, that we did not believe that North Korea presented the opportunity that merited a head of state summit. This is a very important point. I am totally for diplomacy. I believe right now that the best thing that we can get to make sure they don't get that capacity to hit the United States homeland with a nuclear-tipped missile is some type of diplomatic agreement where they're freezing their testing of missiles and nuclear weapons, and we're potentially offering some degree of sanctions relief. They're skipping way ahead of that to the head of state summit. They're giving one of the biggest concessions that we had to offer in that negotiating process that would have come after that type of freeze for freeze. They freeze their nuclear program, we potentially freeze elements of our sanctions or even potentially elements of our military exercises. We sat down, ultimately President Obama sat down with the leader of Cuba and had at least a phone call with the leader of Iran. We didn't even have a face-to-face meeting with the leader of Iran because we had historic breakthroughs. With Cuba, we normalized relations. We established diplomatic relations, opened embassies. With Iran, they agreed to a deal that is so far ahead of anything that is contemplated here, preventing them from having nuclear weapons, shipping out 97% of their stockpile. Here, without anywhere near that, we already have the photo op that is what Kim Jong-un ultimately wanted.
Let me bring in some perspective. A fellow author, to all you guys here who've written books, historian, Michael Beschloss is with us here in our New York studios. Michael, I just would like you to react to the conversation, but more importantly, what we've heard, what we've seen from halfway around the world in the last few minutes.
Well, for starters, Brian, one of the things you always ask is what is different about this? And one thing that is really different is the scene that we're seeing right now, which is the President of the United States meeting with the North Korean leader in secret with only interpreters. You go back to Nixon and Zhou Enlai in China, 1972. He went with Kissinger. He went with other diplomats. That's usually the way it's done. So the question is, why is the president doing this in secret? What is he telling the North Korean leader, and what is the North Korean leader telling him that can't be heard by other members of their parties? And there is so much at stake. I think that's a real question.
Let me ask you, Michael, a question that speaks to reading your history, and I'll ask this very gently. What if during their conversation, Kim Jong-un says to Donald Trump, I would like to make an offer in good faith to return to you the Pueblo?
Well, that would suggest that he's going back in history. And for those of our viewers who don't remember the Pueblo, that was a Navy ship that was taken by the North Koreans, as you know, Brian, January of 1968, with about 80 American crewmen aboard, was held for most of that year and had a lot to do with electing Richard Nixon, because a lot of Nixon's stump speeches were, he said, when a seventh-rate power like the North Koreans can take an American ship and hold it hostage, that means that there's not enough respect for the United States.
Michael, it's Rachel here. It's nice to see you.
Hi, Rachel.
We've been talking a lot about how different this has been approached by this administration. Obviously, it's different in terms of the top line. No U.S. president has ever agreed to meet with a North Korean dictator before, even though for 70 years the North Koreans have wanted that. But in addition to that, the president has bragged about how he hasn't prepared. There isn't a South Korean ambassador. There hasn't been preliminary staff work done for weeks or months, or even years, like there might have been done to prepare for something like this with another presidency. Do we have any examples from history about why those things are important, about why presidential preparation, why staff work, why not having a meeting without a note taker, and those things are the protocol, are the norm? How did we get those?
It's important so that if a president has a stomachache that day, that things do not go off the rails, or if he forgets one of the things he's supposed to bring up, his diplomats will be there and saying, Mr. President, you meant to mention that as a requirement of the offer you're making, you want this from the other side. When you have Donald Trump with this, what he said at the Republican convention in 2016, I alone can fix it. A president alone is not necessarily the best guardian of American interests.
Michael, in terms of what is going to happen over the course of this evening, Andrea Mitchell reported right at the very beginning of our broadcast that as far as NBC sources go, we believe that whatever the communique is, whatever the agreement is, that joint statement was already agreed to before the president, Kim Jong-un, sat down. We believe this is going to be about 45 minutes, and then there's going to be an expanded bilateral agreement. What do you think the odds are that there could be some surprises over the course of this evening, or do you feel like at this point this is essentially scripted?
Well, I think as a baseline, you're going to have what they've agreed to, and that's very much in the tradition of the history of normal diplomatic relations. For instance, our negotiations, 72, when Nixon met with Mao and Zhou, they had pretty much gotten close to what the result of that summit would be, which was, among other things, Shanghai Communique, which said that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. So that's a little bit reassuring. But when you begin this summit with this secret meeting with only two other people there that might be extended, that opens the possibility that this could go into all sorts of directions that we are not anticipating, and frankly, not the best way to do it, at least when one of the leaders in that room is the leader of a democracy.
Michael, let's talk about this tonight, not as a TV show, but as a reflection point in history. I was checking the geography out the other day. The peninsula, the Korean peninsula, is 200 miles from Hiroshima. It's less than 170 miles from Nagasaki. Those are the last times that mankind used nuclear weapons against other elements of mankind. And the whole world has had almost 3/4 of a century without the use of weapons we own, that we have the access to. When you look at what's happening in Singapore, is there a chance this is going to extend that 3/4 of a century or not, of not using nuclear weapons against each other?
would be nice to think, Chris. And, you know, one thing that we sometimes don't remember about the Korean War is that Harry Truman was urged by some people to use the nuclear weapons we had at the time, and Truman said, absolutely not. He could have ended that war quite easily by using those. So, you know, and now we're getting into, Chris, you know, the whole question of how this meeting might be looked at historically. 50 years from now, if we're looking back and historians and other Americans and others say, here was a chance that a general nuclear war that could have killed huge numbers of human beings, not only in the Korean Peninsula, but in the Northern Hemisphere, that was averted, that this will be a very great day in history. On the other hand, if it doesn't lead anywhere, or if it doesn't prevent that kind of danger, this will be seen in a very different light.
Michael Beschloss is here with us and of counsel to us throughout the evening. Michael, thank you. I've been told Kelly O'Donnell has some news to report from Singapore. Kelly, has to do with how the coming together of these two men came together.
Well, Brian, you've been talking about a lot of the stagecraft and the symbolism of what we've just witnessed. And what went into that? Of course, we know that the White House had to pull this together in a very short amount of time on the standard of summits of this scale. They also had to weigh the varying equities of Singapore, the host country, which is footing the bill, estimated at somewhere at $15 million for security and logistics. One of the president's top officials, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, Joe Hagan, who actually comes out of Bush world, having served both Presidents Bush in the past. It was his charge to try to negotiate with North Koreans. And sources tell me that was a difficult task because of the lack of trust over time. And part of what was required was trying to find ways to get the North Koreans to agree to some of the stagecraft that we have seen, the greeting, the display of the flags, who would be in the room, who would not be in the room. All of that was part of a negotiation that I'm told was at times contentious and difficult. At times there was no cooperation from North Korea at all. At times a willingness to step forward. Joe Hagan has a lot of experience in this. He was one of the top officials doing it. And then separately, there have been delegations referred to as a working group led by Ambassador Kim and with representatives from the Department of State and the Department of Defense, experts in the area of energy and nuclear, the National Security Council, who have been meeting with North Korean counterparts over the last few weeks, multiple sessions a week. Some of that was done at the demilitarized zone. They, of course, have then moved here. And so there have been a few orbits that have been below the surface and not getting as much of the attention that have been trying to lead toward this time. Of course, we also know when there was the on-again, off-again part of this summit, one of the president's top officials had said it's simply too short amount of time left to get this to possibly come together. So there was a time pressure, and there was, what we understand, some nodding to the concerns of North Korea and also Singapore. One of the elements that, Brian, you'll appreciate, having been a White House correspondent yourself, there is not the full complement of journalists that we typically see. But for that handshake, we are told it was evenly matched. Two sets of journalists from North Korea and the United States balanced in just that moment. Brian?
Kelly O'Donnell covering it all from Singapore. Kelly, thank you for that background.
We're going to bring into the conversation now Admiral James Stavridis. He's a retired four-star admiral. He served from 2009 to 2013 as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. He's now Chief International Security and Diplomacy Analyst for NBC News. Admiral, thank you very much for being with us. We're honored to have you with us here tonight.
Thanks a lot. Good to be with everybody.
When you look at these pictures tonight, just big picture, when you consider the fact that the President of the United States, for the first time in history, has decided to bring this pariah state into the community of nations, or at least into an equal relationship with the President, with this sort of a meeting, what's your overall reaction about this moment in history?
Before I even get to that, Rach, I just want to point out we've really gone from the sublime to the ridiculous in the coverage, in the sense that Michael Beschloss absolutely correctly says we may look at this as a real pivot point in history, and then we default to the, hey, who's paying the hotel bill? And I think that is a pretty good example of what we're seeing here. It's hard to score this one at this point, but if you ask me to put kind of a percentage on it, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic, call it 70% chance that over time, if we're patient, this could lead to a real diffusion of tension and possibly a reduction in nuclear weapons. Here's the bad news. I think there's a 20–25% chance that it just defaults back to the old way of doing business, and there's still going to be a 5 to 10% chance that the wheels really come off and we end up in a war-fighting situation. But for this moment, we ought to enjoy the day. This is a good moment for diplomacy compared to where we were 6 months ago. I'll take it.
When the president, or at least the Secretary of State, talk about offering security guarantees to North Korea, what does that mean in civilian language? What are they talking about in terms of assurances that we could give their leader or their country in terms of their security?
Yeah, great question. What Kim Jong-un will look for is first statements. Those are not particularly reassuring to him, but he'll want at least in writing that we are not going to seek to change the regime. More importantly, he will look for a reduction in military exercises between the United States and South Korea. He'll look for a reduction in Japanese military activity around the peninsula. He'll look for a reduction in our reconnaissance flights. He'll look for a reduction in our strategic bombers, which can operate from great ranges over the peninsula. And ultimately, what he's after is a significant reduction in the 28,000 U.S. troops that are on that peninsula. He's got a shopping list. He'll work down that list. Our job is to not give in to that until we see absolute, verifiable, irreversible reduction and ultimately dispatch of those nuclear weapons on the peninsula.
The president repeatedly, and even from before he was a public figure in political life, has criticized the long-term presence of U.S. troops overseas in places like South Korea, where we've got tens of thousands of American troops stationed, as you know, obviously. If the North Koreans are going to use the summit to push for reductions in those things you're just describing, in military exercises, in reconnaissance flights, in the presence of those nuclear-capable B-52s, if they're going to push for that, how much could the U.S. give on those issues before there was a material effect on our national security and that of our closest allies, the South Koreans and Japanese in particular, for whom we've accepted responsibility to protect them?
We absolutely have, and these are treaty allies, Rachel. South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan in the Pacific. And so as we draw down our forces there, we do open up our national security concerns. And we ought to remember our troops are there not as an act of goodwill to South Korea. They're there to enhance U.S. influence in the region, to ensure that we keep those sea lanes of communication open, that our trade can flow freely, that we have a voice in the events there, for the exact same reason that we still have about 50,000 troops in Europe. They're not there as an act of goodwill. They're there to accomplish U.S. national security objectives. So we draw them down at risk to those objectives, and it is very short-sighted to say, oh, yeah, this will be a twofer. We can reduce tension and save some money by getting our troops off the peninsula. Not the right way to think about this one.
Retired Admiral James Stavridis, who is the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. Pleasure to have you with us tonight, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We are joined on the telephone to track another story we've been following tonight that broke on our watch by Robert Costa, the national political reporter for the Washington Post and moderator of Washington Week on PBS. And this is about the heart attack suffered tonight and announced this evening by the president on Twitter by Larry Kudlow, the president's economic advisor, longtime on-air personality at CNBC. And Bob, what do you have about his condition that could add to the story here?
Good to be with you. Just got off the phone with Mrs. Kudlow, Judith Kudlow, and she is at the hospital with the White House's top economic advisor. She said he is doing fine, that the doctors there are fabulous. We had a brief conversation for obvious reasons. Spoke to numerous friends of Larry Kudlow tonight. They said he has been making phone calls, that he has been sitting up and talking, that he seems to be in the recovery stage, at least at this moment. He spoke to Dr. Art Laffer, one of his longtime friends for decades in the economics realm, by phone tonight. So there's some upbeat news in the inner circle around Larry Kudlow. Kudlow, but details remain somewhat unclear about exactly what happened today.
Bob, let's be honest. Larry Kudlow had an unusual day yesterday on the Sunday shows, and by that I mean this. He really went there on this almost manufactured fight with Canada of all nations on the planet Earth, and accused the Canadians of stabbing Donald Trump in the back. A lot of people who've known and been around Larry Kudlow a long time were very surprised at the tone and tenor and choice of words out of this guy just yesterday.
That is true. Kudlow, for anyone who knows him and has followed his career, he's known for being a wry and gregarious television personality, economist. But he has adopted some of the president's hardline rhetoric since he joined the West Wing in March. And the language he used on the Sunday shows really reflects how many advisors around President Trump, even Larry Kudlow, take up Trump-style language, Trump-style rhetoric once they're inside the White House. But he's really seen as a steady hand, a seasoned presence who has worked going back to the Reagan administration in Republican White Houses and Republican federal administrations. And so he provides this outsider president with some inside knowledge.
Again, the story is a story tonight, not because any news media entity put it out, but the president, in the minutes before meeting Kim Jong-un, tweeted out the fact that Larry Kudlow had suffered a heart attack and been taken to Walter Reed, so we all scrambled to find out his condition. We are happy to receive Bob's reporting that his wife is painting his condition as having improved. Robert Costa, national political reporter with the Washington Post, thank you very much.
And to the point that you're just raising in terms of where we have just recently seen Larry Kudlow, I mean, it is... We're watching this happen right now as we speak. President Trump is in there one-on-one speaking with Kim Jong-un. I mean, within 36 hours, right? We've had this administration say there is a special place in hell for the Canadian Prime Minister, and it's an honor to be meeting with the dictator of North Korea. And we are going to have a terrific relationship.
Yeah. Well, Face the Nation yesterday was just what we were talking about. Yeah. That was a very hot show. Face the Nation yesterday, with Lawrence making that really over-the-top sort of defense of the president, and you'd see the stress in his face. Yeah, I don't think he was comfortable playing that part, but he was a bit of an attack dog there for the president. As Robert just said, Robert Costa, people are so often forced to play the part of very, very aggressive defenders of the president.
Can I just say, though, I know you're not a fan of Bush foreign policy, but we never had a fight with Canada. I mean, it's really hard to make Canada mad.
I agree.
And I'm sure you're not a fan
of countries in the world.
It's very hard to have a fight with Canada. You have to work at it. They're very good friends and neighbors.
Very polite.
I think it was General Hayden who tweeted on Saturday that every time he has been, in service of his country in any capacity, there has been a Canadian alongside him. Right. I mean, they serve alongside Americans in combat. It's very hard to get Canada, France, the EU, all of our best friends mad at us at one time.
While also being very honored to meet with Kim Jong-un.
On the eve of this summit.
By the way, they were alongside us in Normandy. I think we should remind ourselves of that. At Spear Beach. But I think it's interesting. There's a case of not knowing what you're talking about. Trump has to understand, which he doesn't, when dealing with the Canadians, you're dealing with all these sectoral issues. Well, those cedars, shakes, and shingles is a big issue with I worked for this over the years. They have particular sectoral concerns about agriculture and stuff. To a smaller country than us, they matter to them. They have to cut them very specifically. In fact, Churchill once said about British farm economics, we go macro, let's make a big deal, let's sweeping decide these things. And the Canadians have to be careful in what they protect in their industries. And I don't think Trump understood that it's going to be...
about understanding the specifics. That's a given. He doesn't understand the specifics about anything. The idea that, I mean, and again, I say this to you as my friend. I know you're not a Bush foreign policy fan, but we never botched a summit in Canada or Mexico. This is low-hanging diplomatic fruit.
And here, we're all accustomed to living with the reality show, right? So this happens yesterday. He's fighting with the Prime Minister of Canada. Today, he's meeting with Kim Jong-un. Around the world, right? They don't have the luxury of just indulging in, what's the fight in the United States. They are looking, if you're sitting in Europe, or you're sitting in Tokyo, or you're sitting in Seoul, or you're sitting in Beijing, you're looking at a situation where the President of the United States of America is picking fights with our closest allies, inviting Russia back into the G7, calling Kim Jong-un an honorable guy. Like, This is something that is going to change the foreign policy calculations of all of these countries.
And
friends
the president,
and allies.
But the president is not, I don't think, the only way I disagree with you, my dear friend, on this, is that I don't think it was a botch. I think that the president went to the G7 with the intent of blowing it up. That's why he was late to everything. That's why he had the arms crossed. That's why he was being rude to people. And then as soon as he was away and didn't have to say it to their face, he blew it up on the flight to North Korea, because there's something going on with our president. He's all of our president. There's something going on with him where he thinks it is to his advantage for this spectacle he's created right now in Singapore to have blown things up with Canada and with the G7 and with our closest allies heading into it. What I don't understand is how he thinks it's going to work. Nobody else thinks it should work that way. Everybody else, it looks backwards. But to him, this is all on purpose. So why does he think that sets him up well for this?
And the bill will come due later. The thing about foreign policy is it takes months or years for the consequences to become clear. We count on these people in a crisis. When there's a terrorist attack, when we need to launch a military intervention, when we need to counter ISIS coalition, when we're trying to put together a non-proliferation agreement, we count on Canada and Europe to be with us, Japan, South Korea. He's making it that much more likely that they're not going to be with us in a pinch the next time that we need them.
Why does he want to seem like we are alone in the world and don't have any alliances before he goes and talks to North Korea? Honestly, in terms of his own thinking about this.
But does he want to look tough? And that's the message to the North Koreans. I am such a tough guy. Even with Canada, there's no ally.
Even my friends hate me. I'm so tough.
Well, he's so tough. He issued the statement on Twitter after he left.
Yeah,
he couldn't stand up to Justin Trudeau to his face.
But I mean, I don't think we should discount the idea. It's not a coincidence that this is precisely what Putin desires, right? I mean, are we just chalking that up to coincidence? Putin's desire is for the United States of America to have this much distance between America and England.
So what are you saying? What are you saying?
I'm just saying, I mean, do we think it's a coincidence that he's doing exactly
is it?
I don't know. You tell me. I don't believe in coincidences anymore.
Well, that's what prosecutors don't believe in it either.
This is precisely what Vladimir Putin wanted an American president to carry out, a foreign policy that alienates us from our closest friends and shoves us closer to our adversaries.
Putin's getting the return. The greatest return on Putin's investment in meddling in the election took place this week at the G7. But also, Trump has been habitually more comfortable with authoritarians, whether it's Duterte in the Philippines, Erdogan in Turkey, Putin in Russia, Xi Jinping in China. He's consistently praised them.
Hostile to NATO.
Hostile to NATO.
Why aren't we friends with countries like our own? We value democracy, we value free press, we value free speech, and all the rights of people. And these countries agree with us on that stuff. All the countries in the G7 are like us, and the ones he wants to be friends with, Russia and North Korea, are not like us. About basic human values.
And he insists that Russia should come back into the G7. Russia, which has an economy the size of Spain, which is not a democracy and which was thrown out for good reason, he wants them back. Putin today said that he'd be happy to host the G7 in Moscow, except he's not sure he wants in anymore because he's got a good deal going on with China now that maybe is better than the G7 anyway. Putin doesn't want America to have the foreign policy that we have. He also doesn't want the West to have any cohesion so that he can reform the international world order with his own pitifully underperforming country operating and punching above its weight as a foreign power, a foreign superpower.
And pick off European countries from, our Atlantic alliance into his orbit, get the pressure off of his borders. This has been his objective ever since the protests in Ukraine that led to the annexation of Crimea. I was there when President Obama called him to tell him that he would not be in the next G8 meeting. Putin was not happy about that. He hung it all on the fact that he said that we were behind the protests in Ukraine that led to the ouster of Yanukovych, when in fact, they were people protesting on behalf of anti-corruption and democracy. Now we have a president of the United States who won't even speak up for democracy around the world. Not necessarily a coincidence when you consider what Vladimir Putin has been doing since those protests in Ukraine in 2014. He developed an information warfare capability that he used in Ukraine, and then he brought it into our election. And as we've heard most recently from the DNI, Dan Coates, he's going to do it again in the midterm elections and the next one. And that's why this week, this convergence of events is really bigger than even just this summit tonight. We're seeing a kind of reordering of what the role is that the United States plays in the world that we're going to be dealing with for many years to come.
Well, we have learned tonight the lengths to which the staffs of 43 and 44 went to keep the peace with Canada. Seems so quaint and dated as of this past weekend. Listen, the two leaders are talking. That's why you may have sampled some talking on our end. This was from earlier. Cameras have been expelled from where they are. We're going to slip in a break. Obviously, if anything comes out of there, we will hop back in and go immediately live to Singapore. Otherwise, please stay with us. Our live coverage continues just on the other side.